Picture this. No supermarkets, no water bottles, no coconut water with a cute label telling you it's raw and ethically sourced. Just you, a handful of sweaty relatives, and a planet that has absolutely no interest in keeping you alive. So the question is simple, but kind of terrifying when you sit with it. What on earth did our ancestors actually drink before anyone figured out how to grow a single crop? Because farming is a shockingly recent invention. Humans have been around doing human things for roughly 300,000 years. Farming shows up around 12,000 years ago. Do the math, and you'll notice something wild. For about 96% of our species' existence, nobody had a farm, nobody had a well, nobody had a fridge, and nobody had the faintest idea what a smoothie was. And yet somehow they survived. They didn't just survive, they thrived enough to eventually invent beer, then civilization, then reality television. So today we're going all the way back to the thirsty beginning, before irrigation, before pottery, before anyone thought to ferment anything on purpose, to figure out how prehistoric humans kept themselves from turning into human jerky. Let's start with the obvious answer, because it deserves way more credit than it gets. Water. Just water. Rivers, streams, lakes, springs, rainfall pooled in rock. Early humans were basically water detectives, and their survival depended entirely on knowing the terrain well enough to find it. This is actually one of the biggest reasons early human migration patterns follow river valleys and coastlines so closely. It wasn't about scenery, it was about staying alive long enough to complain about the scenery. But here's the thing people don't think about. Drinking random water in the wild is a gamble. Stagnant water breeds bacteria, parasites, and all sorts of microscopic nightmares that could turn a nice afternoon into a very bad week. So early humans had to develop an instinct for water quality, almost like a built-in filtration app running in their brains. Moving water was generally safer than standing water. Water near green, healthy vegetation was usually safer than water near dead animals or thick algae. And water that smelled or looked off was avoided, because a queasy stomach in the ancient world wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be a death sentence. There were no rehydration sachets. There was no pharmacy. There was just you, a hole in the ground filling up with questionable liquid, and the hope that your gut microbiome was feeling generous that day. Now, you might be thinking, okay, water, got it, moving on. But hold up, because early humans had a few genius tricks for getting hydration that had nothing to do with rivers at all. One of the most underrated ones is fruit. Fresh fruit is often over 80% water. Melons, berries, wild grapes, figs. For a forager wandering through a landscape without a single tap in sight, fruit wasn't just a snack, it was a walking canteen. Biting into a ripe piece of fruit delivered water, sugar, and vitamins all in one convenient, self-contained package that also happened to taste incredible. Basically, nature invented juice boxes millions of years before humans invented juice boxes, and forgot to add plastic straws, which honestly was doing the planet a favor. And speaking of plants doing the heavy lifting, tubers and roots were another sneaky hydration source. Wild yams, certain roots, and underground stems store a surprising amount of water as a survival mechanism for the plant itself, especially in dry regions. Early humans figured out that digging these up wasn't just about calories, it was about squeezing a bit of moisture out of the ground in places where visible water was nowhere to be found. If you've ever been impressed by cactus water sold at ridiculous prices in glass bottles at a trendy grocery store, congratulations. Prehistoric humans were already doing that, minus the price tag and minus the influencer holding it up to their face in a bikini, which brings us to actual cacti and succulents. Because in certain arid environments, plants like this were genuine lifelines. Some cactus species can hold impressive reserves of water inside their fleshy tissue, and various groups living in desert-like regions learned which plants were safe to cut open and drink from. This wasn't guesswork either. This knowledge was passed down, refined, tested, and occasionally learned the hard way because some succulents are toxic, and figuring out which ones weren't probably cost a few unlucky pioneers their stomachs. Or worse. Okay, let's talk about something that sounds a little unsettling at first. Blood. Yes, blood. Several traditional groups around the world, particularly in regions where water was seasonal or unreliable, developed methods of drinking animal blood, sometimes mixed with milk from livestock in later periods, but even earlier than that, from freshly hunted game. Blood is packed with nutrients, salts, iron, and yes, liquid. In survival terms, it checks a lot of boxes at once. It's not glamorous, and no, nobody was sipping it out of a mason jar with a cute label, but in certain environments where finding a stream might mean walking for days, draining a portion of blood from an animal you just hunted was an efficient, resourceful, and honestly kind of impressive way to avoid dehydration. Waste not, want not, as they say, except in this case, waste not also meant don't collapse in the desert. Now here's a fascinating twist. Long before anyone was farming grapes or brewing barley on purpose, nature had already been quietly fermenting things behind everyone's back. Overripe fruit that falls to the ground doesn't just sit there being sad. Wild yeast in the environment starts breaking down the sugars. And given the right temperature and time, that fruit begins to ferment naturally, producing small amounts of alcohol completely without human help. Animals do this too, by the way. There are entire viral videos of elephants supposedly getting drunk off fermented fruit. And while scientists debate how much of that is true, the basic chemistry is very real. So it's entirely plausible and honestly likely that early humans stumbled onto naturally fermented fruit long before they had any concept of brewing. Imagine being one of the first humans to eat a piece of fruit that had been sitting in the sun a little too long, feeling unexpectedly relaxed and giggly and having absolutely no idea why. That might be one of the funniest unrecorded moments in human history. No lab, no fermentation vat, just vibes and rotting produce. This accidental discovery is actually central to something called the drunken monkey hypothesis, a real theory proposed by researchers studying primate behavior and alcohol tolerance. The idea suggests that our primate ancestors developed a genetic tolerance for small amounts of ethanol because those who could handle slightly fermented fruit without getting violently ill had an evolutionary edge. More available food sources, more calories, more chances to survive lean seasons. So in a strange, roundabout way, the human ability to enjoy a drink might trace back millions of years to monkeys in trees accidentally becoming the first designated fruit tasters of the animal kingdom. Let's talk trees again, because trees were basically the vending machines of the ancient world. In many regions, humans learned to tap trees for sap, similar to how maple syrup is harvested today. Birch sap, palm sap, and various other tree saps are naturally hydrating, slightly sweet, and packed with micronutrients. Some cultures still practice this today as a seasonal tradition, collecting sap in the early spring when trees are pushing nutrients upward after winter dormancy. For early humans without agriculture, tapping into this seasonal sap flow was essentially free. Naturally distributed hydration straight from the source, no middleman, no marketing team convincing you it was a superfood. And here's a detail that tends to blow people's minds. Palm sap, when left out for a little while, ferments on its own into a mildly alcoholic beverage, sometimes called palm wine in various cultures today. Which means, once again, our ancestors likely bumped into naturally occurring alcohol through an entirely different plant source, completely independent of fruit fermentation. At this point, it should be pretty clear that nature was practically begging early humans to discover alcohol in as many ways as physically possible. Now let's get into honey, because bees deserve an award for being ancient humanity's greatest unpaid business partners. Wild honey isn't just sugar. Diluted with a bit of water, it becomes a natural energy drink loaded with quick calories, useful for hunters who needed a fast burst of stamina before a long chase. But here's the twist that changes everything. Honey, water, and time equals mead. Wild yeast in the Saizam environment, combined with the sugars in honey and a bit of moisture, will spontaneously ferment given the right conditions. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Some researchers actually argue that mead might be one of the oldest alcoholic beverages in human history, potentially even older than beer or wine because it required no farming, no grain cultivation, and no fruit harvest. All it required was finding a beehive, getting stung a few times as a toll fee, and leaving the honey water mixture alone long enough for the magic to happen. So if you've ever pictured cavemen as these clueless, grunting figures with zero sophistication, it's worth reconsidering that image because these people were out here accidentally discovering 3 or 4 different alcoholic beverages through completely independent natural processes, all before agriculture even existed. Honestly, that's an impressive resume for people who didn't even have the wheel yet. Let's shift gears and talk about something a little less exciting but equally important: snow and ice. In colder climates, particularly during ice age conditions that covered massive portions of the planet at various points, water sources could freeze solid for months. Early humans in these regions learned to melt snow and ice, sometimes using body heat, sometimes using small fires, in order to access drinkable water. This sounds simple, but it's actually a survival skill that required planning, patience, and fuel management, because melting enough snow to hydrate a group of people takes time and energy that could otherwise be spent hunting or staying warm. Every sip of water in an ice age environment was, in a very real sense, earned. There's also something worth mentioning here about milk, but with an important clarification, because this is a common misconception. Dairy milk from domesticated animals like cows, goats, and sheep came after the rise of farming and animal domestication, so it doesn't really belong in the before farming category in the way people often assume. However, human breast milk obviously predates agriculture by hundreds of thousands of years, and for infants, it remained the primary source of hydration and nutrition long before anyone thought to milk an animal on purpose. It's easy to overlook something so basic, but it's worth remembering that the very first beverage every single human being who has ever lived actually consumed wasn't water, wasn't juice, and wasn't some ancient fermented concoction. It was milk, straight from their mother, which honestly remains true today regardless of how many centuries of technology separate us from the Ice Age. Now, let's talk about something a little more mysterious and honestly kind of eerie: mineral springs. In various parts of the world, natural springs bubble up from underground, sometimes carrying dissolved minerals, sometimes slightly carbonated from underground gases. Early humans who encountered these springs likely noticed something different about the taste, the texture, maybe a slight tingle, and in some cases these mineral-rich waters may have had subtle physical effects, whether through mineral content or trace amounts of naturally occurring compounds in the ground. Some anthropologists believe certain culturally significant water sources became associated with healing or spiritual properties precisely because of these subtle effects, laying some of the earliest groundwork for humanity's long, complicated relationship between water sources and ritual or religious significance. Long before anyone bottled water and slapped a fancy mountain graphic on the label, ancient humans were already treating certain springs like they were something close to sacred. Let's take a slightly different turn and talk about something a bit trickier: plants with psychoactive properties. This is a subject that requires some care because it's easy to misrepresent, but it's historically significant enough that leaving it out would be dishonest. Various plants, roots, and fungi containing naturally occurring psychoactive compounds have been used by different groups throughout human history, often in ritual, spiritual, or communal contexts, rather than as a casual daily habit. Some early groups brewed teas or infusions from specific plants for ceremonial purposes, tied to important life events, seasonal changes, or spiritual practices. This isn't about recommending or glorifying anything, just acknowledging that human curiosity about altering consciousness through natural substances goes back much further than most people realize. Long before written history, long before formal medicine, and certainly long before farming gave us fields of anything cultivated on purpose. Let's swing back to something a little more universally relatable: the sheer difficulty of simply knowing where to find water in the first place. This is honestly one of the most underrated survival skills in human history, and it's something modern people almost never have to think about. Early humans developed incredibly detailed mental maps of their environment, tracking seasonal water sources, understanding which plants indicated underground water nearby, and reading animal behavior for clues. Birds circling a specific area, animal trails converging toward a single point, certain insects appearing in higher concentrations, all of these became signals, essentially nature's version of a location pin on a map. If you think about it, this was an entire invisible survival technology, built purely on observation, memory, and pattern recognition, passed down for generations with zero written instructions. And here's something worth sitting with for a second. Dehydration is genuinely one of the fastest ways a human body can fail. The human brain and body are shockingly sensitive to water loss. Even a small percentage of dehydration causes measurable declines in cognitive function, physical performance, and mood regulation. In a world with predators, harsh climates, and constant physical demands, staying hydrated wasn't some background health tip. It was the single most immediate priority standing between a person and a very early demise. Every single one of your ancestors, going back tens of thousands of generations, had to solve this problem successfully every single day without a single failure. Or you wouldn't be here watching this right now. That's an unbroken chain of survival stretching back further than most people can wrap their heads around. Let's take a moment to appreciate coastal and island populations too, because their solution to hydration involved an entirely different set of challenges. Salt water obviously isn't drinkable, and drinking it actually accelerates dehydration rather than solving it, because the body has to expend more water processing the excess salt than it gains from the liquid itself. So coastal groups had to rely heavily on freshwater streams flowing into the sea, rainfall collection, or, in some cases, fruits and plants specifically adapted to store fresh water despite growing near salty environments. Coconut water is actually a fantastic historical example here. Coconuts naturally filter and store fresh water inside a hard, protective shell, which made them an incredibly valuable hydration source for island-dwelling humans long before farming, refrigeration, or literally anyone put a straw in one for aesthetic purposes. Now here's something genuinely fascinating that connects a lot of these threads together. Researchers studying ancient human remains and archaeological sites have found evidence suggesting that access to reliable water sources directly shaped where early human settlements eventually formed long before agriculture existed. Caves near reliable springs, riverbanks with year-round flow, and areas with consistent rainfall patterns became hotspots for early human habitation, essentially some of the very first prime real estate in human history, except instead of good school districts, the deciding factor was simply, will I die of thirst here or not? Let's also talk about something people rarely consider: seasonal variation and the sheer unpredictability of hydration in the ancient world. Modern humans experience remarkably consistent access to water regardless of season, but early humans had to constantly adapt. During wet seasons, water was abundant, plants were juicy, and life was relatively easier. But during dry seasons or droughts, entire groups had to migrate, sometimes significant distances, purely chasing reliable water sources. This seasonal rhythm likely shaped migration patterns, social structures, and even conflict between different groups competing over limited water access during harsh periods. In many ways, the earliest tensions and cooperative alliances between human groups may have been shaped less by territory or food in the abstract sense, and more specifically by access to drinkable water, which honestly puts a lot of modern arguments about who finished the last bottle in the fridge into a pretty hilarious historical perspective. Here's another layer worth appreciating. Early humans likely developed early forms of water storage long before pottery. Hollowed-out gourds, animal skins, large leaves folded into makeshift containers, and even ostrich eggshells in certain African archaeological sites have been found modified for water storage and transport. This is actually a huge deal, because it meant humans weren't just reactive water finders anymore, they were becoming proactive water planners, carrying resources with them into new territory, extending how far they could travel without needing to immediately find a new source. This single shift, learning to carry water rather than only drinking it on the spot, may have been one of the quiet, unglamorous innovations that allowed humans to migrate into new, more challenging environments across the globe. Let's bring it back to something a little lighter for a second, because honestly, imagining the trial and error involved in figuring out what was safe to drink is kind of hilarious in a dark way. Somewhere out there, throughout tens of thousands of years, there were countless nameless humans who tried drinking something they probably shouldn't have. Someone, somewhere, definitely tried random plant sap that turned out to be toxic. Someone definitely ate a slightly too fermented fruit and either had the time of their life or an incredibly rough night with zero context for what was happening to their body. These unnamed, unrecorded individuals were essentially humanity's first unpaid, unwilling taste testers, and every safe food and drink source we know about today exists because somebody at some point took a risk and either survived to tell the tale or didn't survive at all, which unfortunately still counted as useful information for the group. Now let's zoom out and think about why this whole topic even matters. Beyond simple curiosity, understanding what ancient humans drank before farming existed tells us something deeper about human ingenuity and adaptability. Humans didn't have biology on their side the way some animals do. No built-in ability to survive weeks without water like a camel, no specialized organs for extracting moisture from dry air. What humans did have was observation, memory, social learning, and the ability to pass knowledge down across generations. Every method covered in this video, from tapping trees to reading animal trails to recognizing safe versus dangerous plants, represents an enormous, invisible library of survival knowledge built painstakingly over hundreds of thousands of years without a single written word. And this is honestly one of the most humbling things about studying ancient survival. We tend to imagine early humans as primitive or unsophisticated, but the reality is the complete opposite. Surviving in unpredictable, water-scarce environments required an incredibly refined, detailed, and constantly updated understanding of the natural world. These weren't lucky people stumbling through life. These were highly skilled environmental experts whose job was quite literally staying alive using nothing but their environment, their knowledge, and their community. Let's take a moment to appreciate just how much farming actually changed everything, because the contrast really puts this whole discussion into perspective. Once humans began cultivating crops and domesticating animals, water use transformed entirely. Suddenly, humans needed water not just for personal hydration, but for irrigation, for animals, for larger settled populations that could no longer simply migrate toward the nearest water source whenever things got difficult. This is actually one of the reasons early farming civilizations tend to form near consistent, reliable water sources like the Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, and the Indus River, because farming essentially locked humans into a fixed location. And that location had to have year-round water access, or the whole system would collapse. In a strange way, the shift to farming actually made hydration both easier and harder at the same time. Easier because settled communities could dig wells, build irrigation channels, and eventually create far more reliable water infrastructure than any nomadic group ever could. Harder, because farming communities were now completely dependent on that one location working out long-term, with none of the flexibility that earlier nomadic groups had when a water source dried up or an area became unlivable. Now, here's something that ties this whole story together in a surprisingly poetic way. Beer, one of humanity's oldest intentionally crafted beverages, may have actually played a role in why farming started in the first place. There's an ongoing, genuinely fascinating academic debate about whether early humans began cultivating grain specifically to guarantee a stable supply of ingredients for fermented beverages rather than purely for bread or basic nutrition. Some researchers argue that the desire for reliable, intentional fermentation, essentially the desire for beer, may have been one of the motivating forces behind the agricultural revolution itself, which means it's entirely possible that one of the most transformative shifts in human history, the invention of farming, was partially driven by our ancestors' appreciation for a good drink. Something to think about next time someone questions why you're excited about a new brewery opening near you. You're just honoring an ancient, deeply human tradition. So let's bring this all together. Before farming, before pottery, before permanent settlements, humans hydrated themselves through an incredible patchwork of natural resourcefulness. Water from rivers and springs, moisture from fruit and roots, blood from hunted animals, sap from trees, honey diluted into an energy drink, naturally fermented fruit and mead discovered completely by accident, melted snow in freezing climates, and coconut water on tropical islands. Every single one of these solutions required deep environmental knowledge, careful observation, and generations of accumulated trial and error. What's remarkable is that none of this required a single domesticated crop, a single farm animal, or a single permanent structure. Humans survived, adapted, and even developed early forms of alcohol entirely through interacting cleverly with the natural world exactly as they found it. It's a powerful reminder that human intelligence and creativity didn't begin with agriculture or writing or cities. It was already fully present tens of thousands of years earlier, quietly solving one of life's most basic and urgent problems, one clever discovery at a time. And honestly, next time you grab a glass of water without a second thought or crack open a cold drink after a long day, it might be worth remembering just how much invisible history sits behind that simple act. Somewhere behind that convenience is an unbroken chain of humans who figured out how to find water in the desert, tap it from a tree, extract it from an animal, ferment it by accident, and pass that knowledge down through hundreds of centuries. All so that eventually you could stand in front of a refrigerator, door open, cold air blowing on your face, complaining that there's nothing to drink. If you found this as fascinating as I did putting it together, let me know down in the comments what surprised you the most, whether it was the blood drinking part, the accidental mead discovery, or the theory that beer might have actually inspired farming itself. And if you're curious about more deep dives into how ancient humans figured out survival long before modern conveniences existed, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of rabbit hole this channel loves exploring.